Good morning. This is the third message in our series for Lent called Seriously, God? Making Sense When Life Doesn't Make Sense. And 2 weeks ago, we introduced 3 principles to keep in mind throughout this series. 1, it makes sense that God doesn't make sense. An all-powerful, all-knowing being would not always think as we think, nor act as we act. Secondly, when God does not make sense, we can still grow in our understanding because God has revealed himself through the scriptures and in the person of Jesus Christ. And thirdly, be careful not to confuse life not making sense with God not making sense. Last week, we looked at how to make sense when God says no. Jesus shows us how God's no's help us to live in true freedom. Freedom from being enslaved to our desires, evil, and the opinions and whims of other people. This week, we look at the times when God seems to let us down. Times when God does not deliver on the promises of life. Times when the life we dream of is met with disappointment. We can feel like God doesn't care. This is where we find the main character from today's first reading from the book of Genesis. First, let's recall what precedes this story. Genesis tells how God created the world good, but then there's a fall from grace and things deteriorate rapidly. Chapter 3, we have the fall, which results from eating the forbidden fruit. Chapter 4, Cain kills his brother Abel. And the pages of Genesis tell how evil multiplies until humanity becomes so corrupt that God grieves his creation. So God sends a flood to wipe out humanity, with the exception of Noah, the only righteous man on earth. God saves Noah's family and humanity and begins anew. But the problem of evil isn't solved simply by wiping all the bad people off the face of the earth. The effect of sin is much deeper. Evil lives in the human heart. Instead of sending another flood, God cultivates a special relationship with one person through whom he will bring blessing to the whole world. Starting with Abram, later called Abraham, God spreads his righteousness and goodness in the world. We're first introduced to Abram in Genesis chapter 11, when we learn an important detail about him and his wife Sarah. Sarah was barren and she had no children. This is heartbreaking for any couple. You or someone you know may struggle with infertility and desperately want a child. Infertility was even more heartbreaking during the time of Abram and Sarah. In their time, children were everything. Your value and your worth, your chance at immortality came from having children and the generations that would follow you. Timothy Keller, in the book Counterfeit Gods, explains in an individualistic culture like ours, an adult's identity and sense of worth is bound up in abilities and achievements. But in ancient times, all the hopes and dreams of a man and his family rested in the firstborn son. Abram had no son. Sarah was barren. Abram comes from a wealthy family. He lacks nothing materially, but he desperately and painfully wants a son. God has a plan to bring humanity back into relationship with him through Abram. God wants people to know him. Abram simply wants a son. In Genesis chapter 12, God speaks to Abram. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. From these promises, Abram would have inferred that God was promising him a son. For a great nation to come from Abram and for God to make his name great, Abram would require ancestors. Abram will leave the comforts of home and follow God only because of his deep desperation. He needs a son and follows God, hoping that he will give him one. Like Abram, many of us begin a relationship with God because we need something. We come to God hoping that he will deliver it. Here's what's so amazing about God. He humbles himself so much that he accepts us all the same. Certainly, God doesn't want our relationship to remain based on something we need, but he stoops down and accepts us with love. How truly humble is our all-powerful God. God promises Abram a son if he leaves his family and homeland, and Abram obeys. Sort of. Abram hedges his bets by bringing along his nephew Lot. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram figures that if he doesn't get the son, at least Lot is with him. The writer of Genesis hints here that Abram actually disobeyed. He disobeyed God because he didn't trust him completely. Abram didn't start off in perfect obedience. We see his doubt reflected in a passage just before the one we read today. Sometime afterward, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield. I will make your reward very great. Years have passed since God's first promise of a son, and Abram begins to fear greatly that his dream will never bear fruit. We can also fear that our dreams for the future will not bear fruit. This is natural. But God invites us to turn away from fear and trust in him. In those times, we need to discern that it really is a promise of God. But if it is something God promised us, then it is okay to tell God we feel let down by him. It's okay to vent to God. God can handle it. And that's what Abram does. And God reassures Abraham with a sign. The Lord took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. Just so shall your descendants be." God takes Abram outside and points out the stars. In an age without electric lights, the night sky would have had numerous stars, countless stars. But some scholars believe that it was daytime when God took Abram out. God's message was that even though you can't see the stars right now, you know that they're there. In the same way, even though you can't see your descendants yet, trust that you will have them. And the passage continues. Abram put his trust in the Lord, who credited it to him as an act of righteousness. Simply having faith in God has value. It puts us in right relationship with him, just as any relationship built on trust. When the storms and problems of life frustrate our greatest desires, we often ask, why, God? A better question is, what, God? What are you teaching me about you? What does trusting you in this situation look like so I can come into a right relationship with you? God allows storms and problems in our life so that we will turn to him in faith and trust. God wants to bless us and bless others through us. But for us to fully use those blessings, we must have a firm foundation of trust in him. Without it, you'll crumble under the weight of those blessings. So this week, let us ponder, what problem blocks you from fulfilling your hopes and dreams? Pray this week for the grace to place your hope and trust in God.